That was the wildest, most private, and most thrilling night of my life. It began like any other family get-together, the type we've all attended many times before. My sister Vivian planned a small celebration for her youngest, Ethan, who had recently turned 18. Everyone in the house was talking. The home was bustling with visitors, and Ethan, who had always been a timid youngster, had transformed over the past year into a taller, more self-assured, and shockingly charming adult. He could be heard laughing and the clinking of cutlery as people helped themselves to slices of cake and refills of beverages. My brother-in-law and my husband Marcus were drinking beers and talking about something related to football in the living room while Ethan was going around thanking people for their gifts. I was drawn to the kitchen for a little peace and quiet because it was a haven in that house. I had always admired the large window. I busied myself cleaning a few dishes that had accumulated while the sound of conversation and laughter was muffled behind the walls. As I wiped my hands dry and looked around the room, I heard footsteps behind me. "Hey, Aunt Liana." I turned to see Ethan standing at the door with a shy-looking smile on his face. "How is the birthday boy doing, Ethan?" Taunted, punching him lightly on the arm as he approached, and he laughed while resting on the counter next to me. "I'm okay, but it's a little overwhelming." We talked casually for a few minutes about his plans now that he's graduated from high school, his summer job at the local coffee shop, and his hopes for college in the fall, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Perhaps it was just my imagination, but something felt off. I guess I'm not used to all the attention. I noticed something different about him, then, like the way his eyes lingered a little longer than usual, or maybe it was the way he stood closer than he usually would. Though I didn't give it much thought, Ethan changed his weight, and his voice became softer as we prepared to return to the living room. "Aunt Liana," I stopped to stare at him because of something in his voice. Take a good look at him. His eyes were focused, almost worried, and not at all like the quiet youngster I'd seen grow up. "What's on your mind, Ethan?" he said, running a hand through his hair, a motion I remembered from when he was younger and would grow anxious before making a major request, like requesting an expensive gift or staying up late on a school night. "I don't know who else to talk to about it," he added, looking down and avoiding my eyes. "It's something I've been keeping to myself for a while." Worry made my stomach turn a little. Ethan nodded but didn't say anything straight away, so I attempted to speak in a casual tone. "You may talk to me about whatever you know." He seemed to be having trouble finding the appropriate words for a time, but then he glanced up, and the sincerity in his face made my pulse accelerate. "Aunt Liana, it's you." I froze, not knowing what he meant at first. He took a stride. "But what do you mean?" "I've been in love with you for a while now." I didn't know how to tell you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. The ground felt like it had moved beneath me, and all the sounds from the other room seemed to fade into a dull hum. This wasn't happening, though, because my nephew Ethan, the boy I'd watched growing up, helped with homework and babysat, was standing in front of me and telling me he loved me. I finally managed to steady my voice. "I'm not sure what you're saying," but he didn't back away. His eyes remained fixed on mine with a sincerity that astounded and perplexed me. "Aunt Liana, I know precisely what I mean. I've been considering this for a while, and I didn't want to cause any awkwardness, but I couldn't keep silent any longer. For a while, I felt like I couldn't talk, and my mind was racing as I attempted to comprehend what he was saying. Identify a strategy to react to this. It couldn't be genuine." I shook my head. "It's not right, Ethan, to step back and put the counter between us. You're confused. I'm your aunt, for God's sake," he said in a soft but firm voice. "But I'm not a kid anymore. I'm 18, and I know what I want." The look in his eyes and the way he spoke unnerved me. This wasn't some childish crush that would blow over. He meant every word, but I couldn't let it go on. "You must realize that I started to struggle to find the appropriate words, Ethan, and that I had to end this before it got any worse. This is incorrect. You must go on, your family. To me, you are like a son." I thought that once I told Ethan to move on, it would be over and he would take a few days to clear his head, realize it was just a passing emotion, and we'd return to normal, but I was mistaken. It wasn't over. He didn't move from this okay. Instead, he looked down, his expression clouded with pain, and for a moment I felt an ache in my chest. However, this wasn't about me. It was about stopping something that shouldn't have begun in the first place. The following days were odd, by no means. Ethan didn't visit as often as he usually did, even as he grew older. He would call me for advice or stop by for dinner, but after that conversation in the kitchen, he vanished, leaving a strange void. I still believed that his absence was for the best. Perhaps he was embarrassed, perhaps he needed time to process what had happened, and I assumed that time would help him work things out. However, one evening my phone buzzed. Ethan texted me. "Would you like to speak?" Satisfied, I gazed at the screen with my heart in my chest. Part of me wanted to ignore it and act as if nothing had happened, but another part of me felt obligated to help him through this and make things right because, after all, family didn't abandon one another in difficult times. Despite my better judgment, I agreed to meet him tomorrow at 7 p.m. I couldn't focus at work the following day, so I was unable to focus. When I got home, I was pacing the house nervously, wondering what I would say to Marcus when he arrived. Marcus, unaware of the storm that was building inside my head, had gone to a friend's house for the evening to watch a game, leaving me alone with my thoughts and soon with Ethan at precisely 7 p.m. My heart raced as I hurried to the door, trying to keep my composure because this was only a recollection of a discussion. My intention was to diffuse the tension and assist Ethan in overcoming the situation, but when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I sensed a shift in our relationship. He wasn't the awkward, unsure boy I'd spoken to in the kitchen. His posture was confident, his gaze was steady, and there was an intensity in his eyes that made me shudder. "Hey," I greeted him with a shaky voice. "Hey," he replied, and when he stepped inside, his expression was unreadable, but there was a tension between us that pervaded the room. I led him to the living room, where we sat at a coffee table. The silence was oppressive, and for a moment neither of us knew where to begin until Ethan revealed it was Aunt Liana I've been thinking about. His voice was quiet but firm as he said, "I've tried to forget what I feel like you told me to, but I can't." I was about to tell him that this was ridiculous when he held up his hand. He cut me off softly, asking me to listen grudgingly. I agreed, despite my entire body begging me to stop this talk before it got out of control. "This is wrong. I know that. You may think I'm confused since this is only a phase, but I've been in love with you forever, even if his eyes were fixed on mine. This has been there for a while. It didn't just happen yesterday. I've considered it, resisted it, and tried to go on, but my heart is racing. Ethan, you are just 18. Ethan had always been mature for his age, but this time there was a seriousness in his expression as he shook his head and said, "I'm not a child anymore. I know what I want, and I'm not going to run away from it just because it's complicated." His words shocked me. "You've barely started living these feelings. They'll change." I had anticipated him to be uncomfortable and perplexed, but instead he was composed and resolute. "This isn't just about what you want," I added, my voice harder than before. "There's more at stake here. I'm your aunt. We're family. It is not possible. I am aware that it is difficult. You cannot deny that you feel anything," he said in a firm voice. I was momentarily paralyzed, unsure of how to react, and that brief hesitation was enough for Ethan to see right through me. "I know you do," he said softly, his eyes searching mine. "I saw it in the kitchen. You hesitated then, just like you're hesitating," he said, and I hurried to my feet. "Ethan, you must put some distance between us. This is crazy. My nephew is you. We can't. I don't want to hurt you or make things awkward, Aunt Liana, but I can't keep acting like I don't feel what I feel, and I know you feel it too, even if you don't want to admit it." My hands trembled as I backed away from the living room, feeling much smaller than they had been moments ago. Ethan stopped. This wasn't going to happen, and he reached out his fingers, lightly brushing against my arm, and I froze. There was a softness in his touch, a vulnerability that made it impossible for me to move. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he whispered. "I just need you to understand." For a long, agonizing moment, we stood there, neither of us moving, the silence between us thick with unspoken words, and just when I thought the tension would break, Ethan stepped back. He apologized. He said, "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," in a voice that was almost audible. When I think back on it, I still can't pinpoint why I kissed him, but I believe it was because he finally acknowledged it came from both of us. I did not know what was going through my body at the time, but I simply couldn't keep it inside any longer. It started as a quick kiss before we stopped, and then it became a flurry of feelings. I knew he felt the same way, but he pushed me away without saying anything else, and he left me standing there with my heart pounding and my mind racing. The sound of the door closing behind him was like a gunshot, and I collapsed onto the couch. I sat on the couch for what seemed like hours, replaying the conversation over and over again in my mind, hoping that if I thought about it enough, I'd make sense of it. However, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't untangle the mess of emotions that had woven themselves into every corner of my mind for the next few days. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach sank, anticipating another message from Ethan, and every knock on the door sent my heart tumbling. I dreaded the possibility of him showing up again, but a small part of me, one I hated to admit even existed, was almost waiting for it. Marcus noticed something was wrong. He wasn't usually the kind to ask a lot of questions, but after a week of me being irritable, aloof, and jittery, he couldn't help it. "Jules, you've been quiet lately. Are things going well?" One night, he inquired. I forced a smile as we sat down to dinner, ignoring his worry. "I'm fine, just a little stressed with work," I said, and he studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, but he didn't bring up the subject. I felt guilty because Marcus was a good man, and here I was, caught up in something that I couldn't even explain to him and that had no place in our lives. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan didn't get back to me. Family get-togethers became awkward because I felt his absence like a shadow hovering just out of sight. Of course, Ethan was present, but we rarely spoke. Each glance we exchanged held significance, and I couldn't shake the sensation that everyone else sensed the tension, too, despite the silence. One of these get-togethers took a turn I hadn't anticipated. We were at CLA's house again, this time for a laid-back weekend barbecue. The weather was beautiful and sunny, with a breeze that made it comfortable. People were strung about the yard, laughing and enjoying the day. Marcus was off with my brother-in-law again, talking about sports, as they always did. I needed a break from the crowd. I thought I was alone, but as I opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water, I heard the door creak behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat when I saw it was Ethan. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the doorway, his eyes unreadable for a moment. I contemplated ignoring him and pretending we hadn't seen each other, but something halted me. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible beyond a whisper. "Aunt Jess, I need to talk to you." Even though my heart was racing, I told myself to calm down. This isn't the moment, Ethan. This can't wait, even when I know there are people just outside. I've tried to keep my distance and to forget what occurred, but I can't, he added, moving farther into the room. We discussed this, Ethan, and I stepped back, feeling the chilly kitchen counter against my back. "How are you feeling?" I responded, "It's just confusion. It's not real. I've been thinking about it every day since that night, and I've been trying to figure out how to go on, but nothing works." He interjected, sounding firm and steadfast, as if I didn't feel anything. "It's not confused. My feelings have not changed." "You are," I trembled, panicking in my chest. "Making this more difficult than it has to be because you need to go on, Ethan. This isn't right." He drew nearer, and his eyes were intense. "I don't care about what's right anymore. I just want you to know that I love you." "Ethan, stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I didn't want to feel Ethan. I was mistaken, but the way he said it and the sheer passion in his voice made it difficult to think straight. My chest was tight with the strain of everything. "This has to end." "Stop it," I said. His voice was as soft as he said, "I don't want to hurt you, but I can't stop how I feel." He reached out and then gently brushed his hand against mine, causing me to flinch and pull my hand back, but the warmth of his touch lingered on my skin, sending a wave of confusion through me that said, this wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. You don't have to say anything. He took another step toward them. I tried to ignore the gravity of what he was saying, the intimacy between us, and the memories by closing my eyes, but even as I did so, I could sense the tension because I knew this discussion wouldn't end the way I wanted it to. In the air, drawing us together and frightening me, and then, as I opened my mouth to speak again, a door opened, startling us both. Marcus's voice came from the hallway. "Liana, are you in here?" Panic struck me, and I hurried to put as much distance between Ethan and Marcus as possible before Marcus emerged in the doorway, grinning. "Ah, there you are. CLA's looking for you outside." I nodded, forcing a tight smile. Marcus looked between me and Ethan, who appeared to smell the tension in the room, and said, "Everything okay here?" "Yeah," as my hands trembled a little as I picked up the water bottle off the counter. "I'll be right out," I said quickly as well. We were just discussing college and Ethan's plans for the autumn when Marcus glanced at Ethan and then back at my skepticism that was flickering in his eyes. He didn't say anything, though, okay? "Well, stay in CLA." Ethan remained silent as he left the room, but I nodded once more while waiting and feeling the weight of his stare. I followed Marcus out into the yard, trying to force the entire encounter from my mind, but I knew deep down that things between Ethan and me were far from over and the story wasn't finished yet. He simply stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Some part of me didn't want to leave, but I couldn't stay like this without another word. I was in a mental haze for the next few days, barely able to concentrate on anything. Every time I thought about how close we had come to something I didn't want to even acknowledge, I was overcome with nausea. I knew I needed to put an end to this to create a boundary that would never be crossed again, but I struggled to find the right words to say. One night, as I lay awake in bed beside Marcus, who was fast asleep, I heard the ping of my phone. I looked at the clock and hesitated for a moment, but then I reached for the phone, my heart already racing, and saw that it was from Ethan. "We needed to talk. I can't continue like this tomorrow at 3 p.m. at your place. Please." I stared at the screen for what seemed like an eternity, torn between responsibility and fear. I knew that meeting him again by myself would only cause more problems and confusion, but I also knew that if I didn't go, nothing would be resolved. This situation couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Regretfully, I typed a response that said, "Okay," just before 3 p.m. the following day. When the doorbell rang, my hands were clammy and my heart was pounding. I looked through the window to see who it was, but I instinctively knew it was Ethan because he appeared tense, his shoulders slumped as he gazed out at the water. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the conversation that would ensue, and opened the door to find him there. "A young, vibrant, and very handsome hey," I said softly. "Hey," he replied. While immediately stepping inside for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging heavily over us. "I can't do this anymore, Aunt Liana," Ethan finally said. Breaking the silence, "I can't keep pretending like I'm okay, like I can just move on and forget everything." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ethan, I understand this is hard for you, but we have to move on. We can't stay in this place. It's not healthy for either of us." He shook his head, frustration and pain flashing in his eyes. "You don't understand. I can't just switch off my feelings. I've tried, and I can't, and I don't think you can either." Looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm your aunt, Ethan. We're family. What you're feeling isn't something we can act on. It's not just about us. It's about everyone else, too. We would destroy so much if we crossed that line." He turned his head. "I know it's complicated. I know it's wrong, but I don't care. I can't keep lying to myself." The intensity of his words hovered between us, causing a surge of panic to rise in my chest. I felt compelled to make him understand that this had to end immediately. We both sat down at the couch and continued the conversation. "Ethan, listen to me," I said, facing him. "I care about you. I love you. But not in the way you want me to have to let this go for your own sake." He looked at me, then his expression softening just slightly, and for a moment I saw the vulnerable boy I had known all his life, the one who had always looked up to me. who had come to me for advice and guidance. Tell me you didn't feel anything, he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. That night in the kitchen, tell me you didn't feel anything, and I'll let this go. I felt the world tilt slightly beneath me. I wanted to say it to give him the answer that would close the door on this whole mess, but the truth stuck in my throat like a stone. I had felt something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to admit to myself, but I couldn't let that truth slip out. That would only make things worse. I wanted to lie, but before I knew it, I told him the truth. I told him what I truly felt for him. If I am honest, I did feel it. Ethan, I said, my voice was barely audible. It was a mistake, but I did feel the excitement through my body. His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might argue, but then slowly he nodded, his eyes filled with a deep desire to go back to that one moment. I could just feel it, and suddenly I felt the same. I knew I was the person that was in control, and so I leaned into him and grabbed his chin. I kissed him once again. Once again, I was the person that started the drama. I just couldn't hold it this time. We both didn't hold back, and we let ourselves go. As I was going with my hand through his hair, I felt something I had never felt before. It was so exciting, so wrong, but yet so exciting. And then before I knew, we went way further than what we had already done. It was a crazy moment. Thinking back on it, it is all a blur for me, but yet something in me craves to get back to that moment eventually. As we done and still both lying on the couch, I told him this was a big mistake and that we couldn't tell anybody. He told me he was truly in love and that he wanted more of it, but I told him I didn't. As I was grabbing my clothes, okay, he whispered, if that's how you feel. He turned away from me, walking a few steps towards the window. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of everything he had been carrying. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, but I knew I couldn't. This was something he had to come to terms with on his own. After a long silence, he finally spoke again, his voice low and resigned. I'll move on. I'll try anyway, but I don't know how long it's going to take. I nodded, my heart heavy with guilt and relief. You'll get through this. Ethan, you're strong. You'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there staring out at the water, lost in his own thoughts. I waited a moment longer, unsure of what else to say before turning to leave. But just as I was about to walk away, I heard him speak one last time, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'll always love you. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I walked away, leaving Ethan behind on that bench by the pond, knowing that we had both been changed by this in ways that neither of us would ever fully understand.